He didn't believe in signs anymore. That had been a younger man's superstition back when hope still felt like oxygen and the world hadn't learned how to press on his chest. But that afternoon, with the sky over Manhattan, the color of pewter, and rain hanging undecided in the air, Alexander stopped mid-stride because a glint of silver cut across the edge of his vision. It was small, insistent, familiar in the precise way a voice you loved could be recognized through a crowd. He turned. The child couldn't have been older than 7, maybe 8. She was standing on the marble step outside a bakery where the smell of butter and sugar floated warm as a lullaby. A paper bag creased, folded twice, was tucked against her side. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair was pulled into a ponytail not quite straight, and around her neck, catching the weak sunlight, was a necklace he knew. His mind didn't want to accept it at first. Grief trains you to mistrust any kindness the world offers. But the necklace wasn't a ghost. It was a real thing, a slender chain and a pendant with a delicate curve, almost like a comma mid-breath. Eleanor used to trace that curve with her thumb when she was thinking. The jeweler in Paris had called it a pause between heartbeats. Eleanor loved that. Said it felt like a prayer you could wear. Alexander's feet carried him closer before he'd decided to move. He wasn't reckless by nature. He built his empire by reading rooms, numbers, people. But now, his pulse quickened with a simple, impossible question. How? He stopped a respectful distance away. The child had noticed him, not with fear, but with the cautious alertness of someone used to measuring strangers. There was a steadiness in her eyes, curious, not brittle, a kind of quiet. "Is the chocolate croissant any good?" he asked lightly, because a man shouldn't lead with a memory. She looked down at the bag. "I didn't get the croissant," she said, and her voice surprised him with its clear, bell-like tone. "I got the day-old loaf. They give a discount." "That sounds smart," he said. "Day-old bread makes the best French toast." A spark of interest. "Really?" "Really. It soaks up the egg better." The child's mouth tipped up, then her hand came to the pendant, careless, familiar. She toyed with it as though she always had. Alexander tried not to stare, failed, and felt ridiculous for how much it hurt and warmed him at once. "That's a beautiful necklace," he said, keeping his voice even. "May I ask where you got it?" Her fingers stilled. She looked at him like one might look at a puzzle. "My mom," she said after a beat. It was hers. The words fell through him, not the answer he'd prepared for, if he'd prepared at all. Eleanor had been buried in Père Lachaise with that necklace. He remembered the way the chain had gleamed, the way his hands shook when he let it go. There were witnesses. There was a coffin. The mind does strange things when it wants to unhappen the past, and he checked himself because grief also teaches you not to trust the tricks of longing. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I shouldn't have asked." "It's very special." She looked at him again more carefully this time. "It was a gift," she offered in a smaller voice, and then, as if reassuring herself, she added, "It's mine now." "It is," he said, meaning it, "and it looks perfect on you." A beat of quiet. The city hummed around them, horns, footsteps, the low percussion of rain finally deciding. He should leave. He should let the moment remain what it was, a coincidence wearing familiar jewelry. But memory had its own gravity, and he heard Eleanor say in that dry, amused way of hers, "Alexander, you were never good at pretending you weren't curious." "Do you live nearby?" he asked, aware he was a tall man in an expensive coat and that the world had taught children to be wary of tall men in expensive coats. The girl shifted, considering. "Sometimes," she said, which wasn't the kind of answer an 8-year-old should have to give. "We move." She looked at the bakery door. "I have to go." He read her gall. "Of course." He gestured toward the bag. "Enjoy your French toast." She hesitated, then spun the pendant lightly, as if testing its balance. "It's not a croissant," she said with a smile that arrived like a sunrise. "But maybe it can be French something." He laughed, and it felt unpracticed but real. "Maybe it can." She stepped around him, careful, polite. Alexander let her pass. Then, against the part of his brain that brokered acquisitions and never lost, he turned and watched her go down the block, braid flicking against her jacket. He watched until she was a bright dot at the corner, and still he didn't move, because moving would mean choosing not to follow a sign he didn't believe in. The rain gathered into a fine, steady mist, the kind that darkened the stone and made the city look more honest. He slid his hands into his pockets and felt the folded edge of a paper receipt yesterday's dry cleaning, the smallest, most human detail. He pulled it out, stared at the ink, thought of the line in the will, the line in the burial arrangements, the line in his memory. Necklace, with her. It had never been a question. Unless the jeweler had made a twin. Unless a mistake. Unless someone, somewhere, had done something unspeakably cruel. And woven through those sharp, legalistic threads was a softer one. He was almost ashamed to feel. Hope that wasn't about jewelry at all. Hope that was about the way the little girl had looked at him, steady and curious, and the ease with which she had turned a discount loaf into a future breakfast. Alexander's driver idled at the curb a block away because Alexander never liked a car following him too closely. It made him feel watched. He walked toward it slowly, each step a negotiation. By the time he reached the door, he had decided on a story he could live with for the next 24 hours. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But he would visit LaRoche and Phil's anyway, the Paris jeweler who had called the pendant a pause between heartbeats. He would ask for the original order. He would ask whether any duplicates existed. He would ask for proof, because if the world wanted to play at signs, he could answer with due diligence. "Home, sir?" Malik asked as the door shut, and the city's damp softened into leather and quiet. Alexander looked at the rain stippling the window, then at his reflection laid over the street. He looked tired in the expensive way, the face of a man who had met every obligation and outrun none of his ghosts. "Not yet," he said. "The office." Malik nodded and eased the car into traffic. Alexander watched the bakery shrink and vanish, and with it, the small figure and the glint of silver. He told himself he was returning to the only thing that made sense work. Spreadsheets don't lie. Markets don't comfort, but they don't gaslight you either. You can be ruthlessly honest with numbers and they reward the ritual. Still, in the elevator, that line from the jeweler paused between heartbeats threaded through the hum of floors ticking upward. He walked into the quiet hush of his private level with its framed abstracts and the plant Eleanor had insisted on. Every room needs something alive, and he felt ridiculous again for checking that the leaves were properly watered. They were. His assistant, Mara, had a calendar like a military campaign. Nothing green died within her radius. "You're early," she said, surprised. "I moved the investor call to 4. Paris is on hold for tomorrow," LaRoche confirmed. He stopped. "LaRoche?" "The jeweler," she said, brows rising as if to say, "I live inside your calendar, remember?" They emailed this morning to confirm the archive appointment. "Do you want me to push it?" He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The world, it seemed, had been moving in this direction even before the glint of silver on a rainy sidewalk. Maybe signs didn't announce themselves. Maybe they conspired. "Keep it," he said. "And, Mara, can you look into the bakery on 72nd and Lex, the one with the blue awning? For catering? For curiosity," he said, and heard Eleanor laugh again in his head. "Just, who owns it? Charity programs, that sort of thing." Mara's look said she had 100 questions and the discipline not to ask any of them. "I'll have a brief by lunch." He nodded, then stepped into his office, a clean, modern geometry of glass and walnut that used to make him feel clever and now mostly made him feel contained. He set his phone face down. He set the dry cleaning receipt beside it like proof that he still lived in a world of errands and starch. He stared at the city until it blurred into shapes that didn't demand meaning. He told himself he was fine. He'd done this for years. Wake, perform, excel, collapse into a bed that had learned the language of an empty half. Fine is a scale you can stretch to fit any shape of ache. But the image of the pendant, a comma of light against a child's throat, wouldn't leave him. It wasn't only the pendant, he admitted finally. It was her calm, the way she held the world as if it could be negotiated with, loaf by loaf. His phone buzzed once. A message from Mara. Bakery, community program, day-old discount, voucher exchanges with nearby shelters. Owner, retired teacher named Gagnon. Also, this photo from their page. He tapped. The page loaded, and there it was. A group shot of kids holding paper bags, grinning with the specific intensity of those who have learned to celebrate small wins. Front row, left the girl from the steps, braid a little messier, same bright eyes. The pendant caught the light and flashed like a dare. Alexander didn't believe in signs anymore. He believed in patterns. But maybe the difference, he thought, was only in how you named what you were willing to follow. He opened his calendar and stared at the block labeled La Roche and Phil's. He should add a note. He should add a reason. Instead, he typed a single word into the private field where no one but him looked. Why? The next morning arrived like a question he hadn't answered. Alexander woke before the alarm, he always did, but lay still, listening to the soft machinery of the apartment, the heat clicking on, the city far below doing its first stretch. When you live high enough, the sounds blur into weather. He missed the kind of morning that had a voice. Eleanor humming off-key in the kitchen, a kettle insisting, a spoon knocking ceramic. He made coffee in silence and told himself there was no reason to go back to the bakery. Curiosity didn't need to become ritual. He went back to the bakery. He told Malik he'd walk. It was only 10 blocks, and he wanted to feel the city answer his feet. He cut through a small park where the grass kept pretending it wasn't tireless, and the benches held their private dramas, dog walkers, a couple having the kind of fight that requires expensive therapy, a man reading a paperback with a cracked spine like it had survived more lives than most gadgets do. Alexander realized he was cataloging the world to delay admitting what he wanted, to see if the girl would be there. The bell above the bakery door gave a soft ding that sounded, stupidly, like welcome. Warmth wrapped him. Butter again. Sugar. Flour. The room had small tables and a case of pastries that looked like they'd been arranged by someone who understood that beauty is a kind of hospitality. Behind the counter, a woman with kind eyes and teacher posture smiled at him. "First time?" she asked. "Second," he said, and that surprised them both. "What can I get you?" "French toast recipe," he said before he could stop himself. "For day-old bread." Her grin widened. "You must have talked to one of my regulars." She tilted her head toward a handwritten card by the register. "Day-old French toast Mrs. Gagnon's method." "I'm Carol," she said. "We put that out for the kids who come with vouchers. Makes the bread stretch. As a sound who have locutions." He nodded, because his throat had gone tight without permission. "I'm Alexander. You look like a coffee and something honest," she said, then laughed, as if hearing her own line. "We don't sell dishonest things. Don't worry. Coffee would be great," he said. And any chance a little girl named, he realized he didn't know. The knowledge caught him wrong-footed. She has a braid. Quick smile. Wears a necklace that, he stopped himself from saying that shouldn't exist. It's a comma shape. Carol's eyes softened in the way of adults who know a lot and offer only what is safe. "You mean Sophie." Sophie. The name fit like a note in a song you already knew. "Yes," he said carefully. "Soph." He tried it on his tongue. "Sophie. She's a sweetheart," Carol said. "Sharp, too. Does math in her head like she's trying to impress the universe, and the universe is impressed. Carol set a mug on the counter. She comes by mornings when she's on this side of the neighborhood, not every day. Sometimes, as she says. Sometimes, he echoed. The word again wearing too much weight for its size. Does her mother come with her? Carol hesitated, then chose a polite truth. Sophie has a guardian who's in and out. There's a caseworker trying to make sure things are more in than out. Meanwhile, we run a little program day-olds, vouchers from the shelter. Some of the folks in the building upstairs chip in. Kids can trade chores for store credit. Teaches math, pride. Her smile tilted. Breakfast should never be a miracle, but sometimes it is. We try to make the miracle predictable. Compassion with structure, he thought. Eleanor would have loved Carol. Tell her. The words jumped out, clumsy. If you see her, tell her a man named Alexander likes French toast and owes her thanks for the recommendation. Carol folded her hands lightly over the counter in a way that said she saw more than he said. I'll let her know, she promised. He carried his coffee to a corner table. He didn't need to stay. He stayed. He read emails he would not remember later and signed approvals he had already mentally granted. He watched a teenager count change like it was a test. He watched a toddler drop a croissant flake and look bereft until their mother called it confetti for your tummy, which made the whole room smile. He almost missed Sophie. She came in quietly, as if not to disturb anyone's narrative. Braid, jacket zipped to the top, paper voucher in one hand, a library book in the other, something with a blue spine and a sticker that said 12+, which made him wonder whether she'd argued her way into the older kids section. She greeted Carol with a nod that carried more dignity than should be required at 8. Carol flicked her eyes to Alexander, almost imperceptibly, then back to Sophie. Got any confetti for your tummy today? Just bread, Sophie said, but smiled. Please. Alexander stood up, because sitting felt like hiding. He didn't want to be a wallflower in his own life. He wanted to be careful. Those things rarely agreed with each other. Hi, he said, stopping at a gentle distance. French toast report, success. You were right. She looked up, startled, then relaxed by a degree that felt like a gift. It's not a croissant, she said, as if picking up a thread they'd left on the sidewalk. But it can be French something. It was French something, he said. And very good. She accepted the compliment like a diplomat. Not shy, not greedy. Her hand drifted to the pendant because it seemed to anchor her when attention found her. The chain caught the bakery light again, and the memory in his chest did its familiar, painful flare. I'm Sophie, she offered, because she was brave enough to make introductions when adults forgot. Alexander, he said, and heard how formal he sounded. He softened it. Alex, sometimes. Sometimes, she repeated, testing it. That's a good word. It is, he said. It means there's room. He nodded toward her book. Good? It's about a girl who solves codes, she said, eyes lighting with the private joy of talking about something you love. She thinks in patterns. Me too, he said, before he remembered that once upon a time he had thought in poems. Carol packaged a small loaf and slipped an extra muffin into the bag, with the kind of sleight-of-hand generosity that only works when everyone agrees not to notice. Sophie noticed and said, "Thank you," the way you do when you've learned that gratitude should be visible. Alexander didn't want to ask his question here, with sugar in the air and good people making breakfasts happen, but the moment had a shape. He could feel it. May I see? He gestured, careful. Your necklace. She touched the pendant and looked at him with that measuring calm. Because you like it. Because I knew one like it, he said. The truth, trimmed to fit. A long time ago, she considered that. Then she held the pendant out on its chain so he could see the curve up close, elegant, clean, a quiet revolution in miniature. His breath hitched because the jeweler's workmanship was unmistakable. LaRoche had a way the metal tucked under itself like a secret. If this was a copy, it was a copy made by someone who loved the original. "It was my mom's," Sophie said again, and then, in a voice that borrowed strength from the floorboards, "That's what I know." He nodded. "That's a good thing to know." She released the pendant, and the chain made a small sound like a comma falling back into the sentence. "You look like you knew someone who liked commas." "I did," he said, "and let the past be what it was, whole, unfixable, dear." She said they were breaths you could read. Sophie smiled in a way that clicked something right in the room. "I like that." He wanted to ask everything. He asked almost nothing. "What's your favorite French toast topping?" he said instead, because respect sometimes looks like patience. "Powdered sugar," she said, then whispered, like a conspiracy, "and cinnamon." "Classic," he said, relieved by how ordinary the conversation could be. A phone buzzed on the counter Carol's, and she excused herself with an apologetic nod. Alexander and Sophie stood in the little space between the pastry case and the door, two people pretending to only be discussing breakfast while the air between them held denser questions. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, gentler than the sidewalk version of the question. "Sometimes," she said again. "We're on a list." "A list?" Sign for an apartment," she said, and the fact that she said it without bitterness made him want something better for her with a fierceness that startled him. Lists, vouchers, caseworkers. He knew these words from the safe end of philanthropy reports. It was different hearing them folded into a child's Tuesday. "Do you like school?" he asked. "I like the library," she said, "and numbers, and the lady who teaches us how to make a budget." She shrugged, then squared her shoulders like someone who had decided to keep moving forward because forward was the only direction. "It helps." "It does," he said, thinking of the budget he might draw for a heart and finding the columns empty. Carol returned, eyes doing that subtle scan again. "All set," she said to Sophie, sliding the bag across. "And Mrs. Gagnon says to tell you your book review last week made her cry in the good way." Sophie flushed with pride. "She's very—" "Me too," Carol said cheerfully. "Leak like a sieve over a good story." Alexander felt himself smile at the exchange, then took a small risk. "Sophie," he said, "do you ever have time after school to—" He stopped, reframed. "Our office has a very serious cookie jar and a view that's unfair to other buildings. We're starting a project where he caught himself inventing nonsense. We read, out loud, to plants. It helps them grow, or so we were told by a very unreliable scientist." He glanced at Carol, asking permission with his eyes. Carol tilted her head. "We don't accept mysterious invitations on the first ask," she said warmly. "But we do accept business cards and references." "Fair," he said, pulling a card from his wallet. He didn't like what cards did to a room, but sometimes a piece of paper is a bridge. He wrote Mara on the back with his private line. "My assistant is better at vetting than anyone you've met. She will give you the biography of every plant in the office." Sophie took the card, serious as a judge. "Do the plants have names?" "He has two to the standard. They do now," he said. "Okay," she said, which didn't mean yes so much as I will carry this possibility. He took a step back because he didn't want to crowd the moment. "I'll let you get to your codes," he said, nodding to her book. "Patterns," she corrected gently. "But codes, too." "Patterns, then," he said. "I'm a fan." She gave him the small, contained smile, again the sunrise one, and then she was gone. The bell giving its dignifying ding as the door closed. Carol leaned on the counter with the posture of someone preparing to say something kind that might be mistaken for meddling. "You're not the first person to be a little bit knocked over by that kid," she said. "I can see why." And quotient sign the cordant helm. "She doesn't need rescuing," Carol added, not unkindly. "She needs consistency. And adults who keep the promises they make." "That sounds like rescuing to me," he said softly, then shook his head at his own deflection. "I appreciate the boundary." Carol's gaze flicked to the necklace, then back to him. "You looked like you'd seen a ghost when you asked about it." "That's fair," he said. "I sort of had." "LaRoche," she said, surprising him. "That's the mark on the clasp, right?" "You notice that?" he asked, startled. "I notice what my kids wear that someone might take," she said simply. "And I notice what might be precious enough that we need to teach a kid how to keep it safe." His ode, from. He swallowed. "Has anyone asked her about it before?" "People ask kids about things they wouldn't ask adults," Carol said. "We teach them to answer what they want, not everything." He let out a breath. "Good." She studied him for a moment. "You one of the good ones, Alexander?" He huffed a surprised laugh. "Depends on the day." "Well," she said, "if today you're good, maybe put that towards something that lasts longer than coffee." He nodded. "I plan to." As he crossed back into the thin winter daylight, Alexander felt a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty that was a luxury he didn't pretend to anymore, but clarity about the next right small thing. He texted Mara, "Please call Child and Family Services liaison we worked with on the library grant. Ask for a general consult, no names yet, just process. Also, double confirm LaRoche appointment and request original order records. And send flowers to Carol Gagnon's bakery with a note, for making breakfast predictable." Mara responded with the efficiency of a rescue team. On it. CF Services, Miss Chen, available for a call at 2 p.m. LaRoche. Documents in archive. Can prepare copies with proper identification and proof of purchase. Bakery. Flowers arranged. He was not prêt. Into the Clyd and Christin, he added one more message. "If we were to set up a reading hour for kids once a week, quiet, safe, snacks, no photos, what would we need to do it, right?" Mara's reply came a minute later, and he could almost hear the smile in the precision. "Background checks, clear consent forms, transportation coordination with shelters, trauma-informed volunteer training, snack budget, book budget, emergency protocols. Also, a name." "A name?" "For the hour," she wrote. "Everything that lasts has a name." He looked up at the city. The buildings wore their expensive expressions. He thought about commas and pauses and the space between heartbeats. "Call it," he typed. "The room with breathing." He was rad. "Not bad for before lunch," Mara sent back. At 2 o'clock, Miss Chen broke the process down in a voice that could have calmed a hurricane. "There are steps, there are lists, there are things you can do that help, and things that feel like help but are not." Alexander took notes like a man learning a new language. "Do not promise what you cannot deliver. Do not make a child audition for care. Do not turn someone's life into your redemption arc. Offer stability like a table. 4 legs, even, sturdy, boring in the best way." After the call, he sat very still. Boring in the best way. He could do boring. He had built entire companies on the virtue of dependable. Maybe the way back to himself wasn't through grand gestures, but through being a man a child could rely on to show up at 4 o'clock with cookies and chapter books and a chair that wouldn't wobble. His phone lit again. An email from LaRoche and Phil's. "Monsieur Alexander, your appointment is confirmed. Regarding the piece in question, our archives show a single commission of the Virgule du Coeur pendant in platinum, circa 12 years ago, to one Madame E. No authorized duplicates. We will prepare the dossier. No authorized duplicates." The sentence walked around the room and turned off the lights one by one. He felt the floor tilt, then stabilize. He heard Eleanor's laugh, not triumphant, not ghostly, but delighted at the idea that life was stubborn enough to complicate closure. He typed a simple reply, "Merci, à demain," and sat back. No authorized duplicates meant 2 lanes of truth. Either the original had not stayed where it should have, or the world had found a way to look like a miracle. Both lanes scared him. Only one asked him to be brave. He closed his eyes and pictured the chain winking in the bakery light. He saw Sophie's careful dignity. He saw Carol's hands, folded like a teacher planning a lesson without paper. He opened his eyes and picked up the phone. "Mara," he said when she answered, "we're going to need a better cookie jar." By late afternoon, the city had ground itself into the same gray hum it always wore before dusk. Alexander's day normally emptied into that hour like water into a sink: emails, decisions, a meeting, or 3 that could have been a memo. Today it held shape. It held directions. He stood at the window long enough for the glass to cool his forehead. Behind him, the office murmured Mara on a call, a printer remembering it had 1 more page in it, the plant by the credenza throwing its ridiculous green into a room designed by people who loved tasteful restraint. He didn't want tasteful restraint. He wanted truth you could hold up to light. "Paris is on your calendar at 10 m.m. tomorrow," Mara said from the doorway, as if she could feel the moment he needed her voice. "LaRoche flagged the dossier under your original order number. They asked for permission to copy any sketches from the atelier notebook." "Yes," he said. "Permission granted." And he turned. "Mara, 2 more things. First, call Père Lachaise. Ask for the records office. Don't say why. Just confirm chain of custody on personal effects at burial. We had an item placed with Eleanor. I need the non-dramatic, bureaucratic version of what could have gone wrong. If anything." Mara nodded, pen already moving. "Second, 4 prime. Second," he said, "I want to send a book to the bakery for a girl named Sophie. Something about codes and patterns, but kind, not condescending. Something that says, 'You are exactly right to love the way you think.'" Mara's mouth softened. "On it." He hesitated. "And one more. Miss Chen mentioned trauma-informed training. If we set up the room with breathing, I want our volunteers to have it before the first kid walks in." Mara's eyes did that small gleam they did when a plan went from wish to logistics. "I'll build the stack, training partner options, scope, budget, schedule. You'll have it by morning." He exhaled. "Thank you. And we have considered to sew clothes that Firstingach says had was Hall." When she left, he picked up his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in years. Jean-Paul Morin, the Paris funeral director, whose voice had been the sound of kindness during the worst weeks of his life. He didn't call. Not yet. He needed to walk into this like a man who understood how to carry a candle through a museum of flammables. He did call LaRoche again. Not because he doubted the email, but because he wanted to hear a human say the words that could undo the neatness of his grief. "LaRoche and Phil's," the receptionist answered, voice butter smooth. "Comment, puis-je vous aider?" "Alexander," he said, switching to French out of old habit. "I wrote earlier. The Vergoulet du Coeur, was it ever made with a micro-engraving? A mark only the atelier would know?" "Yes, monsieur," she said, on the inner edge of the pendant, near the clasp eyelet, a maker's sign and a tiny archive number, invisible to most eyes without a loop. "We have the number in the dossier." He closed his eyes. It was both what he feared and what he needed. "Merci. See you tomorrow." When he hung up, the shape of next steps rearranged themselves. He could not, should not, ask a child for her necklace so he could inspect it like a jeweler's suspect. But he could confirm the existence of a micromark, and, if this road kept asking for bravery, he could find a way to compare numbers later with everyone's dignity intact. 1 step at a time. 1 comma at a time. On the way home, he made the detour he had told himself he wouldn't make. The bakery's blue awning had learned to hold rain. Droplets gathered like strings of beads and let go in patient intervals. Inside, Carol was drying mugs with the efficient gentleness of someone who had dried 1,000 and would cheerfully dry 1,000 more. "You're developing a habit," she said without looking up. "Trying on the idea," he said. She set the dish towel down and tilted her head at him. "You look like a man carrying a box with an unknown number of fragile items inside. That specific? It's a niche skill," she said, grinning, and he appreciated the way she could make a joke out of jargon without making fun of the person who used it. He placed a book on the counter. Slim, blue spine, the kind of cover that felt like it had been designed by someone who loved children smartly. "For Sophie, if that's appropriate. No pressure, no note. Just if it finds her, good." Carol's hands hovered over the book like she was measuring its temperature. "It'll find her," she said. "What do I owe you for those muffins you didn't put in the bag this morning?" he asked. "You can owe me a good story," she said. "Not the whole thing, just the part where you say why your face does that when you look at her necklace." He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was generous to ask for a small truth instead of the whole messy rug. "My wife had one like it," he said. "We placed it with her. The jeweler says there were no authorized duplicates." Carol didn't gasp. She didn't grip the counter. She breathed. And her eyes gentled. And then she asked the kind of question that respects the original answer. "So you're looking for the version of this that doesn't hurt a child?" "Yes," he said. The word came out like a promise. "Good," she said. "Keep doing that version." He went home to an apartment that used to be a museum of 2 and had learned to be a gallery of 1. He made dinner that was more assembly than cooking. Greens, an egg, a slice of bread toasted to something like bravery. He tried to read and mostly looked at the page. He slept in the way you do when your mind refuses to file hard things under later. Morning came with the kind of bright winter light that makes even expensive rooms look honest. He traveled to Paris and back 12 times a year in his old life without thinking about it. This time, the idea of crossing an ocean to stare at an engraving felt almost ludicrous and also perfectly sane. "Car is downstairs," Mara said, her voice in his ear before he could second guess. "I added a call with Miss Chen en route if you want to check assumptions." "And one more thing. Miss Gagnon texted a photo Sophie with your book. She's halfway through and wrote in the margin, 'People think codes are for secrets. They're also for making things clear.'" He swallowed. "Good line." 8-year-old, Mara said. "They'll run the world if we ever let them." He smiled, despite himself. "We should probably let them." The airport ritual steadied him plastic trays, shoe removal, the pretense that order can be achieved by placing your belongings in parallel lines. On the plane, he spoke with Miss Chen, who confirmed what he already suspected. You cannot orbit a child's life and call it care. You either commit to gravity or you stay out of the way. "Don't promise the easy part," Miss Chen said. "Promise the boring part. Promise Tuesday after Tuesday. Promise that when you say 4 o'clock, you arrive at 3:58. "I can do that," he said. "I believe you," she said, and he heard why she was good at her job. She gave belief the way a doctor gives medicine precisely, in measured doses that help. Paris was gray and beautiful and had the audacity to smell like bread everywhere you went. La Roche and Phil's sat on a corner that had decided to stay elegant even when the century turned. Inside, the air was cooler than the street, and the floors knew how to hold footsteps as if footsteps were music. "Monsieur Alexander," a woman said, and held out her hand. "I'm Edith. My grandfather apprenticed under the La Roche who designed your piece." He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for seeing me." She led him past velvet cases that didn't shout, to a back room that respected paper. On the table, carefully arranged, lay an old atelier notebook, a folder with copies of the original renderings, and a loupe. Edith put on cotton gloves and turned the notebook like it was a beloved book we'd all forgotten how to love. "Your wife had taste," she said simply, in a tone that made it a fact, not flattery. The Virgule du Coeur isn't flashy. It asks to be seen by the right eyes. He nodded. She had a gift for asking the world to be better without making it feel scolded. Edith smiled. "The archive number is here," she said, tapping a penciled line next to a delicate sketch of the curve he knew by heart. "And the maker's mark. We can verify both on any piece that claims the design. Can you tell me if any copies were made, unofficially?" he asked. Not certain how to be diplomatic in French about theft. "We never authorized a second pendant," she said. "As for unofficial copies, it would be a crime. Crimes happen. But a copy would not have our micro-engraving, and a very good copy would still be a copy." He took the loupe and looked at the original sketch again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to live for a minute in the quiet of graphite lines and intention. "If I brought you a pendant, if I could you confirm whether it's this one?" "Yes," she said. "No drama in it, just skill." He exhaled. "Merci." On the street outside, Paris moved like a city that had made a hobby out of being beautiful. He sat at a cafe and ordered a bitter coffee and a tart that looked like geometry had fallen in love with fruit. He took out his phone and finally called Jean-Paul. The old grief rose up the way smoke rises, less choking now, but still capable of stinging. "Alexander," Jean-Paul said, and his voice had the exact same kindness, the same stewarding of difficult things. "Tout va bien?" "I'm working on it," Alexander said. "I have a strange question. The day of Eleanor's burial, we placed a necklace in the casket. Could you check your records to verify that the casket was sealed in our presence and transported without interference?" Jean-Paul didn't hesitate. "Of course, I remember the day. I will pull the file. There was a witness sign-off too, in fact. You and your mother-in-law. It owed to them a plane." "Yes," Alexander said, and the name of Eleanor's mother lodged in his throat and called up 100 small rooms of memory. "Please, call me when you have details. No rush." He paused. "Actually, a little rush?" Jean-Paul chuckled softly. "D'accord. I will be thorough and quick." He hung up and stared at the cafe traffic. He was doing the thing Miss Chen had warned against, letting his own need for answers risk collapsing into the center of everything. He wouldn't let it. The investigation was a parallel process. The main one was simpler and harder. Show up, be boring, build the room. By the time his flight lifted off for New York, he had 3 emails from Mara. 1, a draft plan for the room with breathing that read like a blueprint for a good promise. 2, a reply from Miss Chen with notes in the margins that made the plan better. And 3, a photo of his conference room transformed into a temporary reading nook, rugs, beanbags, a shelf of paperbacks that looked like they wanted to be touched. He smiled, alone over the Atlantic, and allowed himself a small thought. Sometimes, you can build the next right thing before you understand the last wrong one. He landed past midnight. The city a quilt of lights that always made him think of circuits and veins. At home, he kicked off his shoes like a man who'd been pretending he didn't need to rest. He poured water and stood in the kitchen long enough to hear the refrigerator hum and remember Eleanor tapping out rhythms with a wooden spoon like they were composing their own domestic symphony. He didn't cry. He didn't not cry. He breathed. In the morning, a message waited from Jean-Paul. File reviewed. Casket sealed at 1437 with you and Emam D. Present. Transport direct to Père Lachaise. Vault room 3B, no custody transfer. Interment at 10 next day. There is no procedural space for removal without the seal being broken in front of witnesses. It did not happen. As Suking has read, he stared at the words until they lost their edges and became the shape of one thing. If the seal had not been broken, and if no authorized duplicates existed, then either something impossible had occurred, or he was about to discover a chapter of the story he had not read. He forwarded the message to himself because part of him still lived like paper mattered more when you held it. Then he texted Mara, "Let's do the first reading hour Friday." Quietly. No announcements. Just a room that breathes. And ask Carol if Sophie might like to come, only if it's entirely her choice and someone she trusts can accompany her. Mara's reply came a minute later. Already asked. Carol said she'd float it without pressure. Also, Sophie left a note with the book. She asked if it could stay at the bakery when she's not there so other kids can read it. She wrote, "Books don't mind having more than one home." He pressed his palm to the counter and steadied himself against the way that sentence tugged at something he'd been protecting. Then his phone buzzed again. A number he didn't recognize, and he answered because the day had asked for bravery, and he didn't want to be the one to decline. "Hello? Is this Alexander?" The voice was firm, but not unfriendly. "My name is Raina. I'm Sophie's caseworker." He straightened. "And Carol gave me your card," Raina said. "She said you were asking the right kind of wrong questions." He almost laughed. "I hope so. Before you ask your next one," Raina said, "I'll tell you what I can tell you without violating anything sacred. Sophie's safe. She's on a stable path, but not yet a permanent one. She's whip-smart and has opinions about the Dewey Decimal System. And she wears a necklace that everyone has told her she may keep, because—" a brief pause, like a careful edit, "because the first thing we teach kids is how to hold on to what's theirs." He let air in, slow. "I won't ask you to break rules," he said. There's a story about that necklace that complicates my past. I'm going to the jeweler to verify something. If it is what I think it is, I'll come back to you, and we'll do whatever is right together, slowly." With permission. Raina was quiet for a breath that felt heavier than phones should be able to carry. "Good," she said finally. "I don't know your life, Mr. Alexander, but I know this kid's. If your version of help turns into stability, you'll have my attention. If it turns into a savior complex, Carol will swat you on the head, and I will make sure you hit your head on a policy." He smiled because the world needed people like this. "Understood. And well you and Tang. Also," Raina added, and he could hear the smallest smile thread through, "Sophie asked if plants prefer mysteries or adventures. For the reading hour." "Mysteries," he said, without thinking. "But only if they're solved." "Good answer," Raina said. "Friday, then. Friday." When the line clicked off, he stood in the quiet kitchen with the knowledge that something unordinary had entered his ordinary days and had decided to stay. He thought of commas. He thought of the space between heartbeats. He thought of a room that could hold both. At 10, he was back at La Roche and Phil's, the table ready, the loop bright as a tiny moon. Edith slid a velvet tray toward him with a practice pendant, a training piece for demonstrating where the micro-engraving lived. "Show me," she said gently, "so you know where to look when the time comes." He bent over the loop and found the mark exactly where she'd said it would be, small, insistent, and a private certainty. He felt something in his chest settle that hadn't settled in years. "Thank you," he said. He left the shop with the address folded in his pocket like a talisman, and a plan in his head that involved patience, permission, and Friday at 4 o'clock. He didn't know yet how to ask a child if he could look at her necklace with a tool that made things bigger. He didn't know yet how to keep his need from crowding the room. He only knew this. He would not take. He would ask. He would not rush. He would show up. And then, because grief is a bilingual country where past and present coexist uneasily, he walked the 3 blocks to the square, where he and Eleanor had once learned to be newly married. People together, how to stand at a stand for crepes and argue cheerfully about the correct ratio of lemon to sugar. He bought one for himself, 2 lemon, just to hear the old debate in his head. When he returned to New York that night, the city seemed to tilt him gently toward Friday, toward a conference room with rugs that didn't match the furniture, toward a jar full of cookies that would not last an hour, toward kids who might read to plants because a grown-up told them plants listened. He slept, not deeply, but like a man holding a candle with both hands. Friday tried to act casual, but everyone could feel it preparing a test. The office didn't know how to host children. It knew how to host capital. Yet, by 3 o'clock, the conference room with the glass walls had become something else. Rugs soft enough to sit on, chairs dragged into a lopsided circle, a row of plants lining the window like polite grandmothers, a cart with water and paper cups, and a jar of cookies that looked comically optimistic about its chances of survival. Mara stood in the doorway with a clipboard because clipboards make order feel possible. "Ground rules," she said to the staff volunteers, their ID badges suddenly looking less important than the name tags they'd stuck on their chests with lopsided pride. "We listen more than we talk. We don't post photos. We ask consent for everything. We don't ask questions that children shouldn't have to answer. We leave our savior complexes at home with our laundry." They laughed, a little nervous. Alexander watched their faces and felt that small, steady flame of purpose catch. If he had done nothing else with his life, this making a room that breathed in a building that mostly held its breath felt like a clean line item. At 3:45, the elevator dinged and the first group arrived. 2 boys who had grown too tall for the jackets they were wearing and were pretending not to care, a girl with hair in careful twists who clutched a book like a shield and a friend at the same time, a pair of siblings who spoke to each other in a private, rapid-fire language of eye rolls and affection. Behind them, Carol, flowers pinned to her jacket like she'd decided to be fancy about it, and Raina, sensible shoes, sensible eyes, the kind of presence that told the room it could relax because a grown-up had arrived. Sophie came in last, holding the elevator door like she'd been elected to the job. Braid, book, that light in her eyes that made rooms honest. The pendant glinted once and then behaved, lying against her collarbone as if it had always known how to be there. "Welcome," Alexander said, keeping his voice casual the way a tightrope walker keeps their shoulders loose. "This is the room with breathing. We named it that because rooms should breathe, and people should too." He glanced at the plants. "The ferns' names are pending. Fernando," one of the boys suggested immediately, with the relief of a kid who needed a joke to claim space. "Noted," Mara said solemnly, writing it down. Raina's mouth tipped up. Carol squeezed Alexander's sleeve once in silent approval and went to sit on the rug like she'd been doing it every Friday for years. Sophie drifted to a window seat and touched a leaf like one might shake hands. Alexander waited until the room had found its seats and then held his palms out, empty. "We read today," he said. "Not for a grade, not for a post, not because anyone told us we should. We read because it's one of the ways we get to decide what to do with our attention." He nodded to the stack of books, a democratic arrangement of mysteries, adventures, poems that didn't rhyme on purpose. Choose what feels like oxygen. They did. Kids know how to choose when you let them. One of the tall boys picked a detective story and immediately started reading silently with his lips moving. The siblings chose the same book and argued cheerfully about whether page-turning should be synchronized. The girl with the careful twists watched the room with a scout's eye, and, when no one was looking, slipped a thin poetry collection into her lap like a secret she intended to keep. Sophie didn't take a new book. She brought out the blue-spined favorite from the bakery, now sporting a ribbon for a bookmark and 3 sticky notes that made Alexander's heart feel something like applause. She glanced up at him like a conspirator. "Mystery," she said, answering the earlier question from Raina's call. "But only if it's solved," he returned. "Obviously," she said, then tucked her feet under herself and began. For 20 minutes, it was simple. Pages and breath and the kind of quiet you don't get in rooms with glass walls. Staff volunteers learned to be furniture comfortable, there, not in the way. Alexander sat beside a plant that might have been a ficus and tried to look as unimportant as it felt to insist on importance at a time like this. He watched the kids read and felt the room's oxygen get cleaner. At the half-hour mark, Carol clapped once, softly. "Cookie interval," she declared. Hydration is revolutionary. They lined up with the strange, earnest decorum that appears in kids who have had to learn how to share early. Alexander stood by the cart to pour water because pouring water is a job no CEO should be spared. Sophie came last, eyes flicking to the cookie jar like she was making a budget in her head. 2, he said. 1 immediate, 1 deferred gratification, and into Hem Lodge. She grinned and chose a chocolate chip now and an oatmeal raisin for later like a person who understood investments. He handed her a cup, and their fingers almost brushed, and the pendant sent a thread of silver across his vision. Raina appeared at his elbow, voice low. "If there's an ask," she said, "this would be a decent moment." He looked sharply at her, surprised. "I wasn't going to—" "I know," she said. "Which is why I'm telling you it's okay to ask, if you do it the way you've been doing everything else, with the option to say no built into the sentence." He swallowed. "I brought a loop," he admitted. "Of course you did," she said, amused. "Make it a science demo. Kids love tools, especially ones that make small things big." He nodded. "Thank you." When the cookies had been reduced to crumbs and the water to air, Alexander stood and held up the small black cylinder, careful that it looked more curious than predatory. "Okay," he said. "Plant, check. We have a magnifying glass for grown-ups. It's called a loop. It lets us see what's already there, just closer. The ferns have secrets, and so do some pieces of metal. If anyone wants to look at a leaf up close, or a coin, or a necklace, anything you're comfortable with, we can play detective for 5 minutes." The boy who had christened Fernando was at his side immediately, brandishing a quarter. "Does George Washington have pores? Let's find out," Alexander said, grateful for the comedic relief. They peered together. "He has patience," Alexander said, "which is like pores for presidents." Laughter broke the moment into something warmer. One of the siblings wanted to look at the texture of the rug. The girl with the poetry book held up a paper clip like it might confess to something under pressure. And then Sophie, calm as weather, touched the pendant with her fingers and said, "Can I see if my comma has a secret? You do not thank a child for trusting you aloud. You do it with your hands." He knelt, so he was at her level, and set the loop on the table between them like a treaty. "You hold it," he said. "You're the scientist. I'll just be your lab assistant." She picked up the loop like she'd been waiting to be asked to hold something delicate. He felt Raina's presence nearby, a good guardrail. Carol smiled at them from across the circle, like a person who had spent her life watching rooms become what they were meant to. "Where should I look?" Sophie asked. "The edge, near where the chain meets the pendant," he said. "Sometimes artists sign their work in a place that's almost a secret." She nodded, hair slipping from the tie in a way that would have made Eleanor's hands itch to fix it. She angled the loop, closed one eye, and peered into the small, precise world. "Oh," she said, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet surprise. "There's a tiny scribble. Not like letters. Like a drawing made of dust." He couldn't help himself. "May I look?" She handed him the loop like a queen handing over a decree. He brought the pendant close, not touching her, careful, patient, and adjusted the lens. The world sharpened until the room fell away. There it was. The mark. The LaRoche microsign, a whisper of an L nested in a curve, and, next to it, numbers so small they might have been a rumor. The archive number. He did not say anything for a moment, because names have power, and numbers do too, and he needed to speak only what the moment could hold without cracking. "I see a maker's mark," he said, keeping his voice even. "It means the person who made it was proud of their work." Sophie nodded, satisfied by the idea of pride done right. "So it's not just any comma," she said. "It's a signed comma." "Yes," he said, "it's a signed comma." Raina's hand brushed his shoulder in a signal that was half comfort, half breathe. He breathed. "Okay," Carol said brightly, clapping once again like a conductor who knows how to bring a room back to tempo. Part 2. Who wants to read to the ferns? They prefer mysteries, but they will accept adventures with strong alibis. And he scotta too. The circle rearranged. Children switching spots in the unspoken choreography of kids who understand that every room has currents. Sophie moved to the window again and read 3 pages about a girl decoding a message hidden in the spacing of letters. Alexander sat on the floor like a student and listened to her voice and let it do what good voices do. Put the world back together in a way that felt survivable. Halfway through, a ripple went through the doorway, an uninvited presence, the kind that shifts a room's pressure. It was a man in a suit that tried too hard to look like it hadn't tried at all. He had a camera around his neck and a smile that had practiced itself in reflective surfaces. The PR team, Alexander thought with a wince he tried to keep off his face, or a freelancer with a sixth sense for human interest. "Sorry to interrupt," the man said, which always means a person isn't. "I'm here to capture the company's new initiative for our socials. Inspirational content does very well. If we could get the children—" "No," Alexander said, standing, not harsh, clear. "No photos." The man blinked in a way that suggested no one had told him no in a while. "We can blur faces in post." "No," Alexander said again, and heard Mara step beside him like a second pillar. "This room is not for marketing. It's for breathing." "But shareholders—" "Breathe too," Mara said pleasantly. "They'll get a memo with metrics later. Right now this is about pages and plants." The man's smile fissured. Raina stepped forward, no clipboard, all authority. "If you need a quote," she said, "you can quote policy. We don't turn children's lives into content." Carol didn't stand. She didn't have to. She cleared her throat in the way of teachers and weather systems. The man backed away, chastened, and someone, Mara, probably closed the door with the kind of finality that makes a room safer by 10 degrees. Sophie had paused reading. The kids watched the exchange with the frank interest of people who have too often been the subject of other people's narratives. Alexander turned back to them and sat down again, deliberately shorter than anyone standing. "Where were we?" he asked Sophie. "Page 62, she said. Then, without a trace of drama, she started again. The room found its oxygen. The plants listened. The crisis passed like a storm that had been seen off by a good fence. By the end of the hour, the cookie jar had lost its hubris and the rug had gained a constellation of crumbs. Kids returned books to the stack with the care of people who understood scarcity. The siblings wrote Fernando on a popsicle stick and stuck it in the fern's pot like a flag on the moon. The tall boy returned the quarter with a solemn nod to George Washington's patience. Sophie lingered. Carol talked to Mara about schedules and forms. Raina checked a box on her mental list with a satisfaction that suggested the box had been unlabeled until today and was now titled A Room That Does What It Says. Alexander edged toward Sophie with the small book-shaped package he had put together like a person practicing restraint. "For you," he said. "Or for the bakery shelf, if you prefer. It's about ciphers and quilts, patterns that keep people warm. Habentfria, harde, fide 5. She took it and turned it over in her hands, feeling the corners like she could tell what kind of story it was by texture. "I like quilts," she said thoughtfully. "They make math soft." "That's exactly right," he said, delighted. She looked up at him with her steady, curious gaze. "Did your wife like commas?" she asked, and he wasn't ready. But he had invited honesty, and honesty accepted. "She did," he said quietly. "She said they were pauses that didn't mean stopping. Just breathing." Sophie considered that, then, with the serious generosity of a person offering something precious, lifted the pendant slightly. "Do you want to someday, not today, see if my comma has the same whispers as your wife's comma?" He did not trust his voice. He nodded. "Someday," he said, "only if you want to." "I'll think about it," she said, which, in the language of 8-year-olds who have had to make adult decisions, meant she had already thought about it and was giving him the dignity of waiting. They walked to the elevator with the others. The hall felt long in the way corporate halls do when fluorescent lights forget they're supposed to be gentle. At the doors, Raina shook his hand like a colleague. "Good work," she said. "Don't mess it up." "Who won?" "In the crowd, work laced." "I'll try not to," he said, and she smiled, knowing that trying is what matters when you back it with systems. Carol hugged him, and he let himself be hugged, because being a person is sometimes remembering you have a nervous system. "Next week?" she asked. "Every week," he said, and meant it. Sophie stepped into the elevator and held the door again like she was still elected, then looked at him. "Thank you for the cookies," she said. "And for letting the ferns listen. Thank you for reading," he said. "They're very picky. You did well." The doors closed. Alexander stood in the slightly too quiet hall and let the day settle over him like a quilt. He reached into his pocket and took out the tiny loop, tucking it back into its case with a care that felt like prayer. The numbers he hadn't spoken hummed in his head. LaRoche's sketch waited in a folder. Jean-Paul's message sat in his inbox. The path forward didn't feel clean, but it felt honest. He returned to the conference room, now a country of crumbs, and began to pick up cups, straighten books, coax the rug back into some idea of itself. Mara joined him on the floor without comment, because good teams don't make chores rhetorical. After a while, she said, "We need more oatmeal raisin next week." "I hear that's controversial," he said. "So is doing the right thing," she said, scribbling a note. He paused, a hand on the edge of a paperback. "Mara," he said finally, "the pendant has the mark." She didn't ask which mark. "Then we go slower, not faster." "Slower," he agreed. "And we tell Miss Chen before we tell our feelings," she added. He laughed, surprised by it, and nodded. "Add that to the ground rules." She did. Then she looked at him with the clear affection of someone who had seen him at his worst and decided to stay. "You okay?" He thought about how useless the question often is and how right it felt tonight. He searched for an honest word. "A comma," he said. "Between heartbeats." "Good," she said. "That's where breathing lives." Monday came with cold, bright honesty. Alexander kept the room sign on the door, "The room with breathing," like a promise he could walk past. He briefed Mara, slower, not faster. "Miss? Chen, before feelings, always consent." Jean-Paul called. Procedures airtight, no breach at the burial. LaRoche's dossier arrived by courier sketches, the archive number, penciled like a secret address. He read it once, then closed the folder, as if closing it could keep the past from rushing in. Raina texted a checklist for week 2. Volunteers cleared, snack rotation, 2 new kids, same ground rules. One note at the bottom. Sophie asked if commas can become semicolons when 2 thoughts decide to stay together. "Tell her yes," he replied. "When both thoughts agree." That afternoon, he met Carol on the sidewalk. She handed him a folded paper Sophie's book review, written in tidy, stubborn letters. "Patterns can be doors. You don't kick them. You learn their knock." Inside, he and Mara sketched a clean path. 1. Keep the reading hours sacred. 2. Request a private meeting with Raina and Sophie, no surprises. 3. If Sophie wants, compare the micromark with LaRoche's number under Raina's supervision. 4. Any next step moves at the speed of trust. At 4, he stood by the window and let the city be a metronome. Grief didn't lunge today, it nodded from across the room. He texted Mara 1 line for the volunteer handbook. Be the person a child can predict. On his way out, he paused at the fern. The popsicle stick flag still read Fernando, now guarded by a circle of crumbs like a small nation recently fed. He smiled, touched the rim of the pot, then left the loop in the locked drawer, and went home with empty hands on purpose. They met in a small side room, door half open, sunlight making a quiet stripe across the carpet. Raina took the first seat like a guardrail. Carol perched by the window, a soft witness. Sophie swung her feet, braid a little crooked, pendant steady. Alexander set the loop on the table and kept his hands still. "We only do this if you want to," he said. "If you change your mind midway, we stop. No questions asked." Sophie looked at Raina, got a nod. "Okay," she said. "I want to know if commas can talk to each other." "They can," he said gently. "Sometimes in numbers." Raina outlined the plan. 2 minutes, no touching the chain. Sophie holds the loop. Alexander reads the numbers aloud to Raina only. If there's a match, the next step is thinking, not acting. Everyone agreed. Sophie lifted the pendant, scientist calm. "Here," she murmured, placing it in the light. She set the loop to her eye, found the tiny coast of metal they were hunting for, and exhaled one small, brave sound. "I see the scribble again. May I look?" Alexander asked. She passed the loop. He bent close. The room narrowed to curve and scratch and a whisper of digits. He spoke them low to Raina, who compared them to LaRoche's sheet in her lap. Raina's mouth flattened the expression bureaucrats use when truth arrives and feelings must wait. "Match," she said softly. They let the word sit. Carol folded her hands like prayer without theater. Sophie, reading faces, asked the cleanest question in the room. "Does that mean my comma belonged to your wife?" And clue. Alexander chose his breath. Then the sentence. "It means this pendant was made as a single piece, a long time ago. It was with someone I loved, and now it's with someone I respect very much." He met her eyes. "It belongs where it is, with the person wearing it." Sophie nodded. "Serious." "Good." Raina took lead. "Next step is story, not custody," she said. "We trace the how, gently. We do not make Sophie's life into a courtroom." Alexander agreed. "No press, no posts, Miss Chen in the loop. We move at the speed of you," he told Sophie. Sophie considered, then smiled small, certain. Then, "Can we read now? The plants get bored." Carol laughed. Raina checked the box in her head titled Trust +1. Alexander put the loop away like a relic, and for the rest of the hour, the ferns learned about hidden ciphers and friendships that keep breathing. The next steps were phone calls with softness built in. Jean-Paul reviewed prep room logs. There was a pause before sealing. He said, "Madame, D. asked for a private moment. Standard." I stepped out. When we returned, the necklace was still visible. Then, the lid. Alexander heard the hinge in that sentence. He booked a quiet call with Eleanor's mother. The old Paris apartment answered in porcelain and air. "Ma," he began, using the name that had survived grief. "I need truth more than comfort. It's silence that felt like lace being folded." Then, before the seal, Ellie asked me to. She wrote it in a letter you never saw her last instructions for kindness. "If love is a circle, keep it moving." I lied by omission because pain was already too loud. He closed his eyes. "Where did it go?" "To a young woman from my literacy group," Ma said. "Scared, brilliant, pregnant, alone. She wore it like courage. Years later, she left it to her daughter. I did not know the path would cross you. I hoped it would find another heartbeat." He steadied his voice. "Her name, Anna," she said. "Anna Rivera, New York. She wrote to thank me once. I kept the letter." Raina traced the map from there. Caseworker precise. Anna Rivera deceased last year. Guardianship in flux. Child, Sophie. Carol filled in the human margins, the bakery vouchers, the book reviews, the way Sophie made math soft. Alexander read Ma's scanned letter at his kitchen table. Eleanor's line, "If love is a circle, keep it moving," sat beside Anna's handwriting. "When I wear the comma, I remember to breathe between shifts." He didn't cry. He did something quieter. He forgave a version of the past he'd been holding like evidence. Then he wrote to Ma, "Thank you for keeping the circle moving. I'll keep it steady. Wrong." The Skiri. Raina scheduled a meeting, no drama, just chairs and tea so Sophie could hear the story from adults who respected her ownership. Consent first. Always. And at the end, Sophie asked the only question that mattered. "So the comma kept going like it was supposed to?" "Yes," Alexander said. "And it's exactly where it should be." They met again in the side room, tea steaming like good manners. Alexander brought the letter. Raina brought time. Carol brought silence that made space. He read Anna's note aloud, how the pendant felt like permission to keep going, how commas were breaths you can wear. Sophie listened with both hands around her cup, like warmth had weight. When he finished, she tapped the pendant, thoughtful. "So my mom knew your wife without meeting her," she said. "In the way that matters," he answered. Raina summarized the path Paris to Ma to Anna to Sophie like a map you could trust. Then she looked to Sophie. "You decide what happens next." Sophie's answer was immediate. "It stays," she said, touching the chain. "But maybe the story doesn't." Alexander exhaled, caught the meaning. "We can put it in a book," he said. "Not the internet. A real one. For the bakery shelf. For your shelf. For the room with breathing," she finished, eyes bright. "With a rule that it's not for looking, it's for remembering. Well, it is strict." "Done," Raina said, checking a mental box titled Child Leads. They set small plans. Alexander would fund a quiet scholarship in Anna Rivera's namebook, stipends, transit cards, boring miracles. Carol would steward it like she stewards muffins no one admits to paying for. No plaques. Only receipts. Before they left, Sophie asked, "Do semicolons mean two thoughts decided to stay?" He smiled. "They mean two thoughts are strong enough to hold each other up." She considered, then grinned. "Good, because I'm keeping both." She squeezed the pendant, slipped her book into her bag, and went to read to the ferns. Weeks settled into a rhythm sturdy enough to lean on. Fridays at 4 meant cookies, plants, and kids who now argued about plot twists like lawyers. Mara ran trauma-informed refreshers. Raina watched for drift and found none. Carol's scholarship fund quiet, receipt clean paid for transit cards and notebooks. The bakery tip jar stopped needing to do heroics. Sophie grew louder in the best ways. She presented a mini-lesson on substitution ciphers, math in a trench coat, and taught the tall boys to stop skipping the poems. Alexander learned the art of arriving at 3:58 and leaving at 5:05. He became boring on purpose. PR tried again with a community impact reel. He posted a single line on the internal wiki instead. Policy. No photos. No stories without the storyteller. The line held. At the library, Sophie found a quilt exhibit. She stood before a pattern called Path of Flight and said, "That's how commas move." He nodded and bought the catalog for the room with breathing. She wrote the caption on the inside cover. For remembering, not looking. One Thursday, Raina pulled him aside. "Guardianship hearing is coming," she said. "The foster aunt has been steady. Sophie wants you there not to speak, just to sit like a chair that doesn't wobble. I can be furniture," he said. He brought nothing but presents and a pocket full of gum for nerves. When it ended, stable placement affirmed. A path to permanency mapped Sophie, squeezed his hand once, quick, and whispered, "Semicolon soon." Outside, under an ordinary sky, he felt the circle moving and promised himself to keep pace with it, no faster, no slower, just right. Spring leaned in. The room with breathing, learned to smell like oranges and glue sticks. Alexander kept the promises small and punctual. On a Tuesday, Ma flew in from Paris with a scarf and a box of lemon cookies Eleanor used to fake dislike. They met at the bakery, after closing Carol wiping down a counter that didn't need it. Raina at the door like a gentle bouncer. Ma's eyes went straight to Sophie and softened in a way that made everyone else into background music. "I am the person who moved the comma," Ma said. "No theater. I did it because Ellie asked me to keep love moving. I am sorry for the secret, and I am not sorry for the circle." Sophie nodded, serious. "I'm glad you moved it," she said. "It found me." Ma smiled, watery and proud. She handed Sophie a thin envelope, Eleanor's short letter, saved for the next wearer. Sophie read the single line aloud. "A comma is a promise to keep going." Then she slipped the letter back like it was a fossil still warm. Later that week, a wrinkle. A distant relative no one had seen in years filed a surprise petition, more attention than relationship, less plan than posture. Raina laid out the facts like bricks. Inconsistent housing, no history of caregiving, a social feed full of inspo posts. "We don't panic," she said. "We prepare." Alexander stayed in his lane. Character references for the foster aunt, a sworn statement about the reading room's routine, boring on purpose. Proof of the scholarship's receipts, no speeches, no stage. At the hearing, the relative tried a performance about family blood and brand new opportunities. The judge preferred homework. Raina supplied it. Carol testified in 3 clean sentences about breakfasts that show up on time. The foster aunt spoke like a lighthouse, steady, bright, not begging to be seen. The petition dissolved under daylight. Afterward, Sophie exhaled like a person setting down a backpack. "Soon," she said again, and this time it felt less like hope and more like calendar. Alexander walked her to the elevator and, because he'd learned, said nothing grand, only, "See you Friday at 3:58. The scare was small and real. On a windy Thursday, Sophie arrived at the room with breathing, with the look of someone practicing calm over a crack. "My comma," she said, very even. "It's not on me." "No, has Roger." Raina moved first chair pulled out, voice steady. "Okay, last clear sighting?" "School library," Sophie said. "I took it off to show the magnifier to a friend. I put it in my pocket. Then, Jim." Then, she stopped. The sentence cliffed. Alexander kept his hands open on the table. "We'll retrace." Slowly. No blame. Commas don't vanish. They wait to be noticed. They walked the path like detectives who refuse to be dramatic. Library, desk, no, lost and found, no, gym bleachers, gum wrappers, a pencil that had seen battles, hallway custodian kind eyes, a promise to check. Carol, on speaker, was a warm, practical wind at their backs. "Pockets lie," she said. "Check linings. Check the place you were when you realized it was gone." People returned to the scene. That place, it turned out, was the room with breathing. Sophie stood by Fernando, fingers against the pot's rim like she was asking it to help. She went very still. "I wanted the ferns to see it up close," she confessed in a whisper. "Yesterday. I put it here so I wouldn't forget. Then I forgot." She reached into the soil's top layer, just under the smooth stones kids like to rearrange. The chain surfaced dull with dust, whole, a small moon pulled from dirt. Raina exhaled in a way that released the room. Carol laughed through the phone, not unkindly. "Plants keep secrets," she said. "Good ones. Add us to the ride at 2-1. Sophie's eyes filled, not with ruin, but with the weight of almost. Alexander knelt to her height. "It did what commas do," he said softly. It paused. It waited. It kept the sentence. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, a little annoyed at biology. "I should put it on a better clasp," she declared. "The way you fix the world one hinge at a time." "We'll do that," he said. "Tomorrow, jeweler, milkshake after." A different test arrived the next week. A school assembly, a local blogger with a ring light, feel-good content poised to harvest. When Sophie's pendant flashed under the stage lights, the camera leaned in like a question mark. Alexander stepped sideways into frame, not blocking, just occupying. "No photos," he said, same tone as before. "This story belongs to the person living it." The blogger tried the word viral. Raina offered policy. The principal, informed and newly brave, quoted both. The room applauded without clapping. Later, outside, Sophie looked up at him with a scientist's clarity. "You didn't make a speech." "I brought a fence," he said. "Speeches are for crowds, fences are for gardens." She nodded, approving the metaphor. "Semicolon in 2 weeks," she said, like a calendar alert dressed as hope. He marked the date without fireworks. He scheduled nothing else that afternoon. He asked Mara to add 1 line to the plan. "When the day comes, let it be ordinary." Ordinary is the point. That night, Ma called from Paris just to say, "I'm proud of the boring you're choosing." He laughed, grateful. He set the loop in the drawer and, beside it, a tiny envelope addressed in Eleanor's hand to the next wearer. He didn't need to open it again to remember the line. It lived in the room now. A comma is a promise to keep going. 2 weeks. A door you don't force. A circle that doesn't rush. He slept like a man who had decided to be furniture and found it surprisingly holy. They kept it ordinary on purpose. No flowers, no speeches, just a Tuesday that showed up on time. The guardianship hearing took 24 minutes. Facts lined up like chairs. Raina did the steady talking. The foster aunt answered like a person who had been doing the job already. The judge, practical and kind, read the findings and signed with a pen that had seen hundreds of small miracles. "Permanent," Raina whispered to Sophie in the hall. "Home." Sophie squeezed the pendant and then Alexander's sleeve, quick and light, like punctuation. "Semicolon," she said, smiling. 2 strong thoughts, staying. He nodded. Exactly. They walked to the bakery because that's where celebrations go when they refuse to become spectacles. Carol declared the cookies on the house and pretended to be surprised when everyone insisted on paying anyway. Ma called from Paris and cried in the good way. Mara texted a photo of the conference room, rugs straightened, chairs in a circle, a small handwritten sign taped to the door. Today, we read mysteries that get solved. After school, they met in the side room, the same chairs, the same stripe of sun across the carpet. Raina placed a single sheet on the table, the order confirming permanency. No cameras, just signatures that meant Tuesdays would keep coming. Alexander took an envelope from his pocket, smaller than an announcement, larger than a secret. "For the room with breathing," he said. Inside was a simple printed page. The story of the comma, no names, no dates, titled "How a Pause Keeps Moving." At the bottom, in Sophie's careful handwriting, "For remembering." Not looking. They taped it inside the cabinet with the cups, the place you only open when you intend to be here a while. "Last rule," Raina said, half teasing. "No one gets fancy." "Agreed," Carol said, already slicing an orange like a benediction. Sophie pulled a book from her bag, the blue spine, soft with use, and held it out. "You keep this here," she told Alexander. "The plants like it. We'll file it under semicolon," he said. She laughed, then touched the clasp at her neck. "We should fix it," she reminded him. "We will," he said. Milkshake after. Later, in the quiet of the room, Sophie read a page about a girl who solved the last riddle not by force but by noticing the pattern that had been there all along. The fern, Fernando, formally leaned into the light like it understood. When the hour ended, they cleaned crumbs without ceremony. The jar went back on the shelf, the chairs drifted home. Raina checked her last box of the day and looked pleased to be out of boxes. Carol tucked a fresh recipe card by the register, French toast for permanency. Exact measurements, optional, patience required. And in Ace. At the elevator, Sophie pressed the button and held the door, elected as always. "See you next Tuesday," she said. 3:58. Alexander answered. "Boring," she teased. "Holy," he said. The doors closed. He stood for a moment in the quiet hall and breathed like a man allowed to be furniture, and found it good. Back in the conference room, he straightened one book and, without thinking, touched the ferns pot the way you touch a shoulder when words would get in the way. On his desk, the loop sat in its drawer beside the thin envelope in Eleanor's hand, opened now. Read. Lived. He didn't need it any more to know what the line said. It was written everywhere. On a bakery recipe card, in a court order, in a kid's neat letters under a title she had chosen. A comma is a promise to keep going. He turned off the light, left the room breathing, and went to meet a kid for a milkshake and a new clasp.